Well, hey, everybody, and welcome back. So glad that you have returned here. We're working on part two of our series on preventing these horrific accidents from happening, cars into buildings. And today we really have a great expert with us. We have John Hollo with us, a registered architect. So it's great to have another discipline here on the podcast talking about these things and obviously a whole different lens he's looking through. So John, I know you've been doing this over 25 years in design and construction. You've worked not only in the early childhood sector, but other industries as well. And we're certainly excited to talk with you today and really pick your brain and get some of that expertise on what people are doing to prevent these types of horrific incidents from happening from the whole design, build, assessment standpoint. So thank you so much for being here with us today, sir.
Happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about this.
So I guess at the very onset here, tell us a little bit about kind of architects and how they become involved in this process and how you kind of even got involved in this whole realm of things that we're talking about today.
There was a point in my career where I actually worked for a major childcare operator, and they had several sites all over the country. Um, and really, when you just see what's going on in the news or you're monitoring what's happening on your own properties, we know that these events happen. And sometimes they're like, little um, minor incidents, and sometimes they're not. And we kind of just got to a point as a company where we said, hey, luck is not a strategy. So we went out and we just started hunting and doing a little bit of research. And we had a few people from my group on the construction side. We also had our legal and risk management side that started to reach out and see what was out there. And we started, you know, looking at products, and it kind of started to connect dots pretty quickly. And we got to people, fortunately, like Rob Reiter, who I know you just spoke with recently, and he just became a great resource. And then Rob got us very quickly with some traction under our feet with other products that we could be looking at. And the differences between conventional thinking versus some of these things that are out there now that's important to consider: crash tested products versus traditional bollards, if you're talking about bollards, but also to kind of look at this because we had multiple scenarios. We had scenarios where we had a number of existing schools already, but we were also developing and growing and building new locations. So to kind of break that down and look and see the things that affect both scenarios was important. But luckily, the company that I was with just said, "Hey, we're going to start to do something about this. So let's put together a group. Let's educate ourselves. Let's kind of come back and see what this could and should look like." And so we started progress. It wasn't, "Hey, you're going to fix this all at once." And to be honest, and this may be a theme as we talk about different scenarios and stuff, this unfortunately will never be perfect. It's not realistic, in my opinion. Um, Depending on your property and what you're trying to do, what your objectives are, the lineal feet of coverage can be overwhelming the area that you're trying to protect. So, and again, that's where dealing with somebody and talking with people like Rob is so helpful. It kind of grounds you, and it's about like just getting you started, covering some low hanging fruit, even, and coming up with different strategies. So, in our model, and having a large portfolio of projects we were looking at, we actually started to put together a site assessment tool where we would break down every property and we would look at aerial maps. In a lot of cases, we would visit the sites and we would just start to look at those contributing factors. Where are we next to street traffic? What is the street traffic? How quick are cars going? Are they ever going in the direction of our building and our playgrounds? Are there intersections where traffic incidents occur regardless of us, but intersections, heavy trafficked intersections, dead end streets that might be facing right at the property, etc., the way the parking lot is laid out, um, the way the parking spots are laid out. Are they angled straight at the building, which is extremely common? Are they at a, angle where they're kind of pointing away? And then you just start putting all these things together. And we created, really our own algorithm that just scored everything and maybe put some higher percentage ratings or rankings when, hey, this is high speed traffic pointing directly at our building, or maybe there's an approach coming into the parking lot or the drive lane that takes you like straight towards, the main entry or crucial, areas where you think there's going to be, occupied by our staff, the kids, the families. And then we started to take that and say, okay, you aggregate that over as many sites as you have, and you start to, at least we did, look at this and say, all right, which ones represented the higher risk? And we just took a batch and we started going to work, kind of coming up with proposed solutions. We looked at the tools that are out there, and started to break that down into, how would we approach this? And then early on, we would lean on people like Rob and some other suppliers and people in the industry that said, here's how you use our equipment or devices, whether it's bollards or guardrails or things like that, and get some feedback and start looking at how some of that comes together.
Well, I think it's interesting. We often talk about kind of the early childhood environment, and really, if you've seen one early childhood program, you've seen one early childhood program. And I know you did work for a large, national chain model, but even then, between mergers and acquisitions and old construction and new construction, I mean, there wasn't always an identical footprint for every building, and that really has caused a lot of significant challenges kind of industry wide, even simple things like fire safety and active shooter, and now the stuff that we're talking about today. So, it's very hard to come up with that one size fits all approach unless you're going to build everything anew, which, again, who's got the money to do all that, right? So,
Right.
how did you kind of approach that? Was, that the locations that were already existing? And then I know you did have the chance, and I know you've actually won some awards. You won the first ever merit award from the Storefront Safety Council. I know you developed and launched a new school prototype design with a cross-functional, cross-cutting team. So I know you do have that experience of kind of putting that architect hat on and say, okay, let's actually design this and then go out and build it too. But for those programs that are existing, how do you start to approach it? And I'm thinking about folks that may be listening from, church-based, religious-based, family providers that are literally in their home doing childcare. How can we kind of start thinking about it from that existing standpoint? Like, I don't have the opportunity to build a new, but what can I do with what I've already got?
Yeah, there is, in my experience, quite a difference in trying to approach solving these problems when you have an existing location versus new. And trying not to get super technical or to overwhelm anybody with all of the scenarios and possibilities. You're right. Whether you're a single small mom and pop shop, single operator, or you have got a chain franchises, etc., this really comes down to a individual site by site consideration. The building design can contribute, but a lot of it has to do with the site and all that stuff. But when you have an existing school and location, you're bound by your starting point. So again, for us, that involved doing a risk assessment, looking at all these scenarios and the parking lot, what's happening with the vehicles near or around the site. Um, but as you look at the parking lot and understanding, coming at this from an architectural point of view, the building has to be designed and built to building codes. The parking lot and the site layout is following municipal zoning ordinances and guidelines. So the spacing and the number of parking spots that are on your site are kind of driven by those municipal requirements. The dimensions, the width of your sidewalks is driven by some minimum requirements, and it's nothing wrong with it, but it's very common for the civil engineers and the architects and the engineers, when you first design a building and a site, is to follow the minimum requirements. If your sidewalk needs to be 5 feet, it's not very common for you to make your sidewalk 7 or 8 feet unless there's another reason to do it. So when you have those minimum standards and you already have that when you're starting this, exploring and doing your research, sometimes adding some of these elements would negate potentially some of those required dimensions. So it really became something where you're kind of balancing the risk reward, if there are landlords that are involved, if you're leasing that property or whatever, that school, you're going to have to get your landlord involved. You should understand the lease and the requirements. Is there a chance that the landlord may participate in some of the burden of doing this, or is it all on you as the operator and tenant? So breaking down all of that stuff, and unfortunately, we found in trying to solve this protection strategy some obstacles. Sometimes you'd want to protect your fence line, but your fence is right on the property line. So gathering the materials as much as you can if you're just getting started, if you can obtain site plans and some of the civil documents, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about implementing goes in the ground. So you don't want to start digging holes around your site without having good, reasonably reliable utility surveys. So you don't want to hit, much less a gas line or electrical line, but hey, we're trying to do something and there's an irrigation line, your sprinkler system for your landscaping. Those are all over the place. So those are things for an existing location that you've kind of just got to understand are going to be dealt with, and putting a team together. And there are people out there. I know you're going to be talking with Ken Skirtich coming up here for another session. We partnered with Ken, and he'd be a great resource for somebody that kind of can put all those pieces together and help you consider contractors and utility surveys and site plans and all that other stuff. So we use those tools, built in the layer with the landlords and the lease requirements, built in some of the things happening with the city ordinances, and then having the team we created. To me, it was really important, more than I realized when we started, how important it is to have some consistency in the people working on solving these problems, because every site is different. And every new person you introduce that's getting up to speed with all of the things that are involved with trying to do this and trying to make the schools safer, it's just different opinions and different subjective approaches to doing things. And again, not that any of it is wrong. It just keeps things a lot simpler when you can have some consistency in the group and some of the solutions that you're putting together. To contrast with new construction, now you've got maybe a little bit more control in some of the decisions before you pin yourself down to some limiting dimensions in the layout of your parking lot. Can you change the angle that the cars are approaching? So maybe they're not even facing directly at the building. The very first opportunity you have with new construction is your site selection. So are you choosing a site, which many people understandably do, that's on the main road or at a corner and an intersection? That's common. There are repercussions when you're going to combine that with a conversation about how do we protect our building from vehicle incidents. So the other extreme is to say, hey, we're going to be second or third tier. We're going to be set back off the road. We're going to be, maybe for now, a nice, quiet, wooded lot where the only traffic we're having to solve for is the traffic coming to our building, not traffic that's surrounding us from, the shopping center next door, etc. Adding in some of the dimensions for your sidewalk depths and everything so you can make room for something like a crash tested bollard or some of the guardrail systems. You can be even creative so that you're not necessarily spending money on the bollards, the hardware, so to speak. You can maybe integrate creative landscaping or topography so that there are natural swells and things that could actually be just as effective in deterring vehicle incidents as purchasing steel and embedding it in the ground. So it's a lot of creativity. You got to start big picture, understand everything, and then kind of use what you can to come up with some creative solutions.
Man, my mind is just racing with all this stuff. I mean, it's considerations that, quite frankly, at first blush, you don't even think about, but you think about even from a national perspective, if you've got thousands of sites across the country and you're trying to get that uniformity, as you kind of already alluded to, the local building codes can really drive that. The building setback requirements, all of that stuff is probably impacting your standard design that you're trying to implement
Exactly.
everywhere. And then, not only that, you're thinking about even American with Disability Act, ADA requirements. If you take your sidewalk and instead of 5 feet, now you got, protective stuff and ballards and planters or whatever you're putting out there. Now I'm worried about ADA access. And by the way, parents have got strollers and those types of things we're worried about too.
Yeah. And
Wow.
that's another great example, the ADA compliance. You don't want to insert a bollard right in the middle of the curb cut that's required for wheelchairs or just, people with special needs to be able to properly, access your property. That right there is a lawsuit.
Yeah.
So, but the good part is when you kind of have, and it can be overwhelming at first to kind of lay out all of these different things you have to consider. But once you do, and you kind of get your arm around it, and you've now got a consistent team. I'd like to think we were pretty successful coming in with some standard kind of plug and play solutions when you have a sidewalk in front of your building, head in parking with handicap parking stalls. That's a very common scenario. And even though, every site is unique and different, that layout is fairly common. So we would come up with a kind of uniform bollard spacing. Bollards, if I haven't stressed this enough, bollards were kind of one of the main go-to tools, a crash tested bollard. And that is different than, and I'm not sure if Rob covered this yesterday, but that's different than the traditional steel filled or concrete filled steel pipe. That is not the level of protection that you think it is.
Hmm.
So there are companies out there that have developed impact tested bollards that would withstand a normal vehicle coming at reasonable rates of speed. But installing those at a certain spacing, because you don't want it to be so wide that a vehicle can get right between them. Otherwise, you kind of negate what you're doing. But, we kind of came up with some very repeatable template approaches to covering those sidewalks, leaving the spacing, and you can kind of start and stop that pattern to respect where you have the handicap ramps and the handicap parking stalls. And again, whether this is new construction or existing, there's some opportunities where, the city may have required for the parking stalls to be interrupted by intermittent landscape beds and, the little trees and the mulch areas and stuff with the plantings. So those interruptions maybe help to your benefit. And if you're designing new, you can strategically place those in your high traffic areas so that maybe you don't have to pay for additional protection. So again, coming up with a template of normal plug and play solutions got us 80, if not 90% there on most sites. We did have certain building footprints and entry portals that were pretty prototypical. So we would look at those and kind of come up with a template that could be, all right, we know how to solve for this brand, this, kind of entry scenario, which is very different than, these one-off buildings that, have pork pushers and drop off facilities and all this other stuff. Those you kind of handle differently. But having the kit of parts or your bag of tools and how you want to approach this, it became much more manageable. And what we would do is we would do all this aerial studies. We'd kind of have a little team where we'd meet every week or so and we'd bring up some of the sites. And each of the project managers on my team would be responsible for proposing how they would solve and lay out the challenges to help protect this site better. And then as a team, and this is where the consistency really is important, we would review and say, okay, that's a pretty, standard plug and play solution. We all feel very comfortable. And then we'd say, okay, you got a unique situation here where, maybe we're a corner lot and there's a major intersection. How are we treating that differently? And maybe we're looking at products that are different than just the bollard. Maybe it's guardrail system, or there's some pretty innovative things happening with structural cable systems and stuff. And we'd propose those. And as a group, we'd say, what's the probability? What are we trying to protect here? And we were obviously limited by some financial considerations with how much are we spending on doing this. And that goes back to the fact that perfection isn't realistic here. You want to do the right thing. You want to walk away feeling like you're protected. But in full transparency, we had sites, and this program went on for multiple years. We did some installations where I would argue we did a great job, even we're heavy handed with our distribution of some of these elements to protect the building. And, a year or two later, we found out a intoxicated driver coming from, two parcels over, went off the road, cut through the backwoods of another lot, and hit our playground in the most improbable way. And it's just like, holy mackerel. We could, even knowing that after the fact, we would have never been able to solve for that effectively. But to, contrast that, I can't tell you the excitement we had, and it was just a random thing, but we had video recordings at each of our schools, video cameras, kind of like your Ring doorbells. And lo and behold, here is a car, one of those kind of oops incidents where somebody stepped on the gas instead of the brake. They launched themselves over the wheel stop, over the curb, right towards the entry where we had put in a bollard. And boom, it stopped. And as a little, initiative team, we were like just cheering, like, hey, it worked. We got one. And that was the greatest feeling, as simple as it was.
I think that's great. What a testament to, the thought and attention you guys put into this. And every time we can prevent something, it is a great feeling, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and I don't know, the scope, how much did like building materials come into consideration? Especially I'm thinking like the scenario you just talked about. If I had an existing program and I didn't have the space or I just couldn't put in a ballard or something like that, would there ever been a thought about, gosh, if we went from a wood structure to a cinder block or a concrete or even a faux brick? Like, did you ever think about things like that when you were looking at maybe retrofits or buildings that you kind of had your hands tied just because of you didn't have a lot of space or didn't have a lot of options?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a consideration. A little less when it comes to the building or wall construction. But if we had a retaining wall or something, and maybe there was a step up to where the landscaping or the building was,
Hmm.
as long as that was significant enough, not just 6 inches or so, but that in itself, we're like, hey, that's our protection.
Okay.
Um, you know, buildings are built from all kinds of different things: wood stud, metal stud, masonry, steel frame. In and of itself, a lot of those things, unfortunately, I've seen the videos where a vehicle goes right through a solid brick wall.
Yeah.
That brick is a veneer, it's a, plane of the building wall. It's actually not structural. And to create structures, even if it's concrete block, that would withstand a vehicle traveling at 15, 20, 30 miles an hour is a whole different level of design than goes into the normal structural wall detail.
Oh, okay.
So they were considerations. And every once in a while, we'd say, you know what, this is, very minimal probability, low speed probability, etc. Concrete wall, maybe some steel frames at some columns or something. We said, we either can go to another area we think is worth more of our time and investment, or maybe just alter what we were doing there and a little lighter touch approach because of the infrastructure that was there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to me just to kind of think through these different, scenarios. And I guess part of that probably comes back to that assessment, right? If you know that you've got a somewhat controlled environment set off, you're not, it's not a ramp right from the freeway to the front door, then I guess probably the low speed impacts are probably more common. And that's kind of what you're planning for on the assessments. And I suppose that's probably a different approach than you are right off the 4 lane major highway and traffic could come barreling through at any moment, right? So I guess as part of the assessment, you're thinking about speed and severity and other factors. I mean, I would even think like, I was dropping my daughter off this morning and the sun was in my eyes, right? And I'm thinking like,
Yeah.
wow, this is a tough spot for a car line. I'm trying to pull in. There's kids everywhere. I don't want to hit anybody, but man, the sun is right in my eyes right now. And I was thinking about this conversation we're having today about, kind of those other factors that come into play as you try to maintain a safe environment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many, and this is where, again, perfection isn't most likely achievable. And for a lot of people coming at this for the first time, it can be overwhelming and it can stifle you even getting started. Um, but that's where kind of having that knowledge, that kit of parts, and, to be transparent, certainly we came across a number of head scratcher scenarios where like, hey, we don't think this is safe as can be. We think there's additional risk here. The normal, whether it's bollards or guardrail, whatever tools you're using, for whatever reason, just don't feel like they're sufficient. Um, we use the easy button. We would call Rob and say, Rob, can you help us take a look at this? Here's our thoughts. Here's our, suggestions. Do you think, this solution is reasonable, or can you propose something? And, what was great about Rob is he's very realistic and he understands financial constraints. So he's not trying to get you to spend $1 million solving every one of these to perfection. But he would come up with creative ideas and solutions and new products. And, you know, when I talked earlier about property lines and fence lines and stuff, playgrounds are equally just as vulnerable, in some cases, even more than the building because of, you don't have the steel posts or the concrete walls, etc. Sometimes you just have a wooden fence or a chain link fence. Um, and this is where, as a team, I'm really proud. We came up with some creative solutions and some partnerships with the suppliers of all of this equipment. And we actually developed some possibilities for the fence post system to
Mm.
be integrated with the bollards, so that you could keep the same fence line introduce the structural stability, and aesthetically, which we haven't really talked about yet. What does that feel like? Because sometimes when you put in guardrails or like structural cable, that might not be the look you want at most childcare.
Yeah.
Does that mean don't do it? No. In fact, I think, again, my opinion, but when you institute a lot of these solutions, whether it's bollards or guardrails, etc., you can flip that to a positive, and you can use that as a selling point when you're talking to new families. You can promote how important safety is. And when all of this stuff is hitting social media and the news, you can, point to why you're doing this stuff, and it's an investment, and you can, use that to help maybe get some enrollments because of the type of company you are, and you're, stressing that importance. A lot of this, stuff we're talking about, again, I think there are aesthetic considerations, and those may be things, again, if you're leasing, your landlord's going to want to know about or ask about. We actually came up with what I thought was some really sensitive solutions. The bollards, the structural bollards, could and most often would have a sleeve that would cover them. We decided to go something that was relatively neutral aesthetically, so that it kind of didn't stand out. So when we talk about bollards, a lot of people think the big yellow bollards that protect, corners of buildings or your dumpster corral, etc. That is not what we used. We did something that, kind of blended in with the background. You could even take that a step further, working with the companies that supply these materials. You can get almost any color you want. You could even incorporate some of your branding. Like right now, you go to, a gas station or a 7-Eleven, and you'll see the bollards. You may not notice them, but they're actually covered with something, showing a sale on, whatever their special is for that week. So there's
Yeah.
all kinds of creative approaches to that you can use to your advantage. But, that's just another consideration in this big idea.
Yeah, we actually with Rob, we mentioned, how you go to the Target stores and they've got their big signature red balls out in front, or even Walmart's, a lot of times they'll be painted kind of Walmart blue and yellow. Just again, you
And
almost
people
wonder,
don't
and
realize that's actually barrier protection,
right, you
and
walk
you
by it all
walk
day
right past
long.
them every day. Yep.
Right, 100%. I was also thinking, just kind of driving down the road, the interstate, and those types of things. And I know you've mentioned a couple of times, like the cabling systems, the restraint systems. Certainly, we're seeing that now in a lot more freeways and highways. Is that something that you looked at integrating with like a playground fence or something? It seemed like that would almost be kind of a natural thing to put in there as well.
It definitely is one of those tools in the toolbox. There are different considerations. So it's a little technical or a structural standpoint. When we compare, I'll keep going back to a crash tested bollard.
Okay.
Those bollards are designed for a certain weight vehicle coming at a certain speed to stop that force. They might bend, they might, wobble, whatever, but they're designed to stop that vehicle within those parameters. Cable systems and even guardrail systems are structurally, they have a different dynamic, a little bit different purpose. So when you include some of those in your solutions, you want to think about the approach or the probable approach angle of a vehicle. So is
Hmm.
that vehicle coming straight on? Or is it kind of coming on a glancing blow or a sloped angled approach where those kind of elements are really in their sweet spot? The cables and stuff, and I'll reference the ones we see going down the median and the highway. Those are really effective for stopping traffic from crossing over from this direction to the other direction. One of the limitations that you just have to anticipate and design around is that those systems do have some give. So there is a penetration depth. So where we considered and did implement cable systems and structural cable systems, you would work with your engineer and they would talk about the lineal feet that you're trying to protect. They would talk about the thickness and the quantity of cables in the system you're designing. And then you kind of get to the point where you say, okay, if a car hits this at speed, this system is going to deflect maybe 2 feet, maybe 5 feet, maybe 6 feet. And no surprise, the more rigid and protection you want from that system, it will affect the cost and the installation, the parameters. But let's say you use that because they are very efficient for the sometimes long, sometimes hundreds of lineal feet of playground exposure, that playground frontage. We would, whenever we could, try to set those in front of that fence line by the number of feet that they are likely designed to deflect
Hmm.
so that the vehicle might penetrate 5 feet, but they still haven't gotten to the playground, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um, and again, some things you have the opportunity to make good decisions when you're laying out your playground. Hey, can you choose to lay it out so it's completely behind the building? It's not even fronting on the parking lot. That's a good, helpful consideration. But if you do, if you maybe can't avoid it, or maybe you're doing a existing playground remodel, we did that all the time, replacing old equipment. Where are you putting that equipment? Are you putting it right up front, close to the fence line, or can you set it back? So even if a vehicle came anywhere near that playground and impacted the fence, etc., your chances are much better of having a safer result if that playground equipment, that concentration where the kids and the bodies are going to be, are set back 20, 30, 50 feet. So that, you don't have that high probability, like, a kid is likely going to be standing right here in this area when this event may or may not happen.
It's interesting to kind of hear you talk through all the different strategies that are really being implemented here. I mean, obviously you've got the prevention, looking at the direction of travel, the flow of travel, the speed of travel. We didn't really talk about calming devices like speed humps or bumps or whatever, but I'm assuming that's probably part of it too. And then we think about kind of this whole intervention series. I guess I'll lump it in, like the deflection, the redirection, the absorption, and again, depending on different strategies of. And I guess the highway's a good example now that I'm kind of thinking, out loud. Like when I'm traveling down the highway, those wire systems are essentially on my left or on my right. They're not directly in front of me, and as you just kind of alluded to, they're not really meant to be directly in front of you because they're just not going to have that much strength. They're more about you bounce off of them or you redirect off of them. They absorb some, but it's really a
Yep.
redirection
Yep.
as opposed to the steel, the concrete, the ballards, the crash rated kind of stuff where that is immediately in front of me because at the end of the day, I want that to take the hit, not my building or my classroom or the people inside, right? So
Exactly.
it's really, I guess, going back to physics and that whole transfer of energy. And it's years ago. I don't know. I have to put my student hat back on to remember all that stuff. But it's really interesting to hear you talk about kind of all these different strategies and even some, you think about design, could I put landscape boulders or could I put, you look at the off ramps in Colorado and some of these other city or states with big, mountains, they put sand, I guess, because that slows the tires down and whatnot. But all these other kind of creative solutions that people are thinking about, which to many of us, again, we walk by it all day long. We don't really think through this. So it's really exciting to kind of hear you process this and kind of work through the different systems in place for protecting the front of the building, the side of the building, and then of course the playground, which let's be very honest, like the typical standard chain link fence is not going to provide any protection whatsoever, right? I mean, maybe if it's a mile an hour or a Tonka truck, but certainly if it's any vehicle with any sort of weight, most of that's going to be breached, I would think.
Correct. Yep.
So if you're, trying to figure out where to start and not to be overwhelming with this, what would you think if I own a child care, what would be the first thing I'd want to do? Some kind of an assessment, some kind of just getting out and kind of walking around. I know you've done a lot kind of, with aerial photography and that kind of stuff, but if you're actually boots on the ground and you own a program, what would you recommend? Kind of like start at the very beginning, like where cars enter onto your property, or what would be the best way to think through this?
Yeah, I think to approach a problem like this, you kind of start big picture and then you bring more and more focus and all that kind of stuff. You look at your adjacency and what's happening with traffic patterns on or around your site. Sometimes that threat is not coming necessarily from the street, but it's your neighbor or it's your backyard neighbor. You know, it's not uncommon for your site to be situated. You solve the head-in parking at your entry, but maybe the next door neighbor has head-in parking all the way down your whole playground fence. And again, you kind of just look at that and say, okay, well, what's involved and how big of a risk is that? How important is that to us? The good thing is, and having that kind of initial team in place, having resources like Rob Ryder or someone like Ken that you're going to speak with in the next session, they can bring a lot of that ready to go experience. So for people, the small mom and pops, et cetera, even if you have a larger program that you're interested in getting started, there are resources out there. And like I said, once we started, we kind of just determined like we're going to do something about this. It didn't take that long to find all of these great people that are super passionate and really smart about all of this stuff. And you just become partners and you incorporate them into your conversations and your team. I'd encourage you, depending again, if you're a mom and pop or a larger group, bring your leadership into the conversation, bring your landlords into the conversation. These are compelling stories when you look at what's out there on social media, the videos. Some of them are tragic. And you'll see not just childcare, but what's happening in the retail, the fast, food industry, the, convenience stores, the dollar stores. There's so much happening out there. I think what's really important is just getting yourself to a place to say, okay, we are going to start. And don't let that big picture and all the details overwhelm you day one. It will come together. And you can do some things that will bring you peace of mind and the opportunity for success.
Well, and I think, the leadership buy-in is something that's just fascinating to me because, most of the time if you want to go do something and it costs money or it costs energy or effort, forget about it. We've always done it this way. It's good enough, blah, blah, blah. You crack that nut, right? And I'm wondering, without breaking confidentiality or anything crazy, like for those folks that want to do something about this, but maybe have a hard time getting leadership buy-in or the leadership understanding the importance of this. Can you take us through a couple of, was there aha moments? Was there strategies that were used? Like what actually made the folks say, yes, this is important. Yes, we're going to go proactive on this. Yes, we're going to invest in this. Was there any tips you might have for people that want to make this happen, but maybe struggle with getting that buy-in?
So, as much as finances are everybody's consideration, leadership, small mom and pops, those are scary things to talk about these numbers. And I'm not going to try to fool anybody. These are not necessarily cheap interventions, but I think it's super motivating when you look at what's already out there, what we know, what we've experienced either on our own sites or, throughout the country. You see these videos, you see a lot of the close calls, and some of them are not, unfortunately, happy endings.
Yeah.
There are tragic, horrible conclusions to some of these stories. And I'm assuming Rob probably covered some of this in his session with you earlier. If you want to talk about financials, the 10 million, 90 million, $300 million lawsuits that are now becoming prevalent and commonplace are pretty motivating factors when you talk about the relatively small investment in trying to do something. And again, this is not legal advice. I'm in over my depth here, but I would suggest those companies that have these awareness of the risk and the incidents, maybe you or your site had something happen. If you do nothing and something happens again, I fear for how the legal system and everybody considers that compared to somebody who can demonstrate this may not be perfect, it may not be completely comprehensive, but there is thought, there's effort to what we did. There's a huge, huge difference.
Yeah.
And I think as this stuff becomes more awareness out there, social media, this stuff explodes. These things with local municipalities, building departments, zoning ordinances, I think certainly the whole country hasn't adopted some universal requirement for vehicle safety barrier protection, but the places that have, I think you'll find a direct correlation to some horrific incident in their community, and they went ahead and they changed their ordinances. I think as licensing, childcare, accreditation teams, etc., get more exposure to this, you're going to start to see these requirements or at least the inquiries creep into their walkthroughs and the things they're looking for and expecting you to have some solutions or answers for. So it's not all that present today, but in my experience and seeing what's happened in the industry, it's starting to come, and so that's the polite nudge to start to think about it.
Yeah. Well, look, I am an attorney, so it's not legal advice because you're not my client, but certainly it is good advice about foreseeability. And when we're talking about 100 plus of these a day, there's arguments to be made that this is pretty a foreseeable event. And I am a little bit curious. You think about for decades now, we've had requirements of putting protection around gas meters that are outside of buildings, especially in these, strip mall, shopping mall type scenarios. I'm surprised that the gas meters are so well protected, yet we're not protecting occupant. You know what I mean? It's kind of odd now that you say that out loud, John, to kind of think about why are we protecting those gas meters, but we're not protecting even a more, seemingly prevalent occurrence that happens literally 100 times a day.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of play this scenario out, and let's just use the hypothetical. You're at a location where something did happen, and maybe it was minor. Maybe somebody, again, put the car in forward instead of reverse, hit the gas instead of the brake, they hopped the curb. Wheel stops, in my experience, do practically nothing. If anything, sometimes they make it worse because when you tap the wheel stop, you tend to depress the gas pedal further, which launches you towards the building. But let's say, something happened and you kind of had a close call incident, but, arguably everybody's fine. Think about the reputation that, let's say the corner of the building was struck, but nobody was hurt. All of your parents, all of the kids, all your staff now feel that, emotional trauma, like, am I safe coming to work? Am I safe bringing my kids here? That stuff hits social media. Now your facility has a reputation, and the internet, we all know, is forever.
Yeah.
Are you going to be the one that is reacting and like trying to fight back the reputation and prove that you have everybody's safety in mind? Or are you possibly that one that can make that difficult decision to be proactive and get this stuff analyzed and assessed and come up with a plan? Obviously, when these things happen, depending if it's your playground and or a classroom, the entry of your buildings, this can lead to, you know, obviously cost of building repairs and all that other stuff. But it's not uncommon that this leads to shutting down the building, the classroom, weeks, if not months of renovations. So all of that stuff that you're dealing with, you got to factor that in, along with the reputation of your location. And for whatever reason, along with a lot of these retailers and the gas stations, etc., childcare happens to be one of those anomalies where it seems to happen more to us than a lot of other facilities.
Well, yeah, everybody's distracted, right? Everybody's in a hurry. Everybody's distracted. There's a million things going on at pickup and drop off, and certainly you raise another great point. I mean, if an incident does happen, even a minor one, you're an architect. Who's going to come out and clear that building to say it's safe now to occupy? Who's going to say that classroom is safe to go in? I mean, I'm guessing one of your engineering colleagues is going to have to come out and do a building assessment or something. You can't just have a car impact the structural integrity of your building and then be open the next hour or something, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
there's a whole kind of reaction sequence to triaging that, understanding the structural supports and soundness of the building and all that stuff. So you have to deal with all of that when these things occur.
hmm. Would you say, like, kind of running in the other architect circles, is this something now that's moved into best leading expected practice on new builds? Is this something like the industry's kind of embracing now? And not only childcare, but like other sectors as well?
So I think big picture, there are probably sectors, whether it be some of these fast service facilities, the gas stations, etc. Some of them, to be blunt, and it wouldn't take much research to figure out who, but some of them are now required to do this.
Hmm.
It's part of their penance, let's say. But there's facilities like healthcare, emergency rooms, where I start to see this, and I think it's become a little bit more obvious that it's integrated into that standard initial design approach.
Yeah.
Um, if you ever got to know Rob, his background with barrier protection for a whole plethora of pretty impressive facilities really gives him some credibility in this industry. Um, but I think it's also still kind of niche where certain architects it's embedded into their consciousness, and others they haven't even you know faced this yet.
Right. That makes
So
sense. It depends on what industry you're in and,
yeah,
and those types of things. But it is curious to see like some of your more transitional spaces, for lack of a better term, right? The gas stations, the drugstores, the things that you're kind of popping in and out of, the dry cleaners, where there's probably more opportunity to, as you said, kind of forget to shift into drive or forget to put it in reverse or whatever have you. Just distracted driving in general.
yeah. The
Seeing these a lot
events
more
are
common.
the statistics are unbelievable. How many events every day that this happens?
Well, and we looked at the data with Rob, and the sad thing is that half the time, 50% of the time that it happens at an early childhood environment, there's an injury or a death involved. And look, the other half, that maybe it's happening when people aren't on the playground, or maybe we're closed, or maybe it's on a night or a weekend or something where nobody's even there. But I don't like those odds, John. Like, half the time it ends in an injury or a death. Like, that's not a game I want to play, right? So, uh,
Exactly.
I'm glad that you're focused on this, and I thank you for all the wonderful work that you've done, and of course, obviously, the award that you've won, and just kind of bringing everybody to bear on this issue, because it is, a lot of different considerations. And I know, we talk about this a lot when we say intruders and active shooter. Like, nobody here wants to turn childcare into a prison. Nobody wants it to look, uninviting. We want this to continue to be open and welcoming and nurturing and caring and all the wonderful things that are happening in early childhood. So designing this in a way that makes sense but doesn't impact, program operations or make it unattractive or scary, is certainly at the top of the list. And I appreciated some of the comments you made today, just about the aesthetics on this stuff as well. Anything else you'd like to add? Any wrap up conversations? How can folks, stay in touch with you, your work? How can they kind of see some of the fruits of your labor? What recommendations or closing thoughts do you have here for everybody?
Well, again, I think it's, an emergency, an emerging but, vital topic. Appreciate you guys helping spread the word, get this information out there, evolve the culture. Hopefully, some good things will come and lives will be saved. So I really appreciate the time. This is kind of fun to revisit and digest all the things that went into putting this program together, and some of the success stories and stuff that we're able to feel good about after the fact. So I just really kind of appreciate that. And I think when you talk with Ken and stuff in the next session, there's just a lot more great information to digest, to put yourself in a position where you can feel like you can take this on and consider what you can do.
Well, 100%. And Rob was nice enough to offer. We'll reiterate to folks today, we're giving out 100 free safety assessments. So if you'd like to be a part of that for your program, a very generous offer from Rob. Just
Jump
drop us
on that.
Yeah, drop us an email, right? Andy@icp.us or info@icp.us. We're also building out a whole website, which is all sorts of, leading practices and case studies and, videos like the one today with John that get, bring you the experts right to your fingertips here so you can really think through these things in a holistic way. And we'll have a whole library of leading practices, ways to make it simple. So you don't have to spend all the time doing the research. You can spend your time hopefully implementing some great solutions in a effective manner. So that's the whole goal of this, just as we try to keep kids safe from hot cars and firearms and bodies of water and everything else that's out there. This is now on the list too of things that are sadly, impacting our children and our families. But the good news, and as John has mentioned today, there are some really great solutions out there in some ways we can prevent these from happening. Maybe not entirely, but heck, even if we can even prevent 50, 75% of them, that's a heck of a start, John.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you being here with us and all the work you've done. Kudos, and thank you from all the families that you've made safer over the course of your tenure here. And thank you for everybody at home sticking with us and listening to us. Part 3 will be coming up, as we've referenced a few times. Part 3, we're going to dive into some really specific, low cost, some large cost, but some low cost solutions as well. Talk about some creative things that others in our industry are doing to keep everybody safe. So again, this is Andy saying thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.